Okay, welcome everybody. This is Josh Haas with the Hawk Migration Association of North America, and we're excited to welcome you all to another in our Lunch and Learn series. So we're really pleased and excited to be welcoming Rebecca McCabe to join us today and speak on her broad-winged hawk tracking and research. So it's an exciting program. We've had similar topics in the past from Dr. Lori Goodrich, and so we're excited to kind of hear some updates and what's really happening in the work that they're doing. So as you can see on the screen, we're excited to be here and really rely on you as our constituents to support HMANA, which in turn then allows us to support our many migration sites across North America. Having said that, if you're willing to and have the means, please visit HMANA.org/support to figure out ways that you can join us in supporting these migration sites all over the country. And also consider becoming a member and join our kettle. Next month, we're going to be featuring Ryan Phillips from Belize, who's going to talk about hook-billed kites. And we also, speaking of Belize, have a really exciting tour opportunity this fall to Belize. It'll feature some of what Ryan Phillips is doing. He's going to help out with a little bit of that tour. And so if you're on the fence and maybe considering going on that tour, it's definitely a lunch and learn to attend because he's going to feature some of the great birds aside from the hook-billed kite that our travelers are going to experience. So that certainly will be a tour of the lifetime. So consider that. Just some housekeeping things. You'll notice that you're not able to unmute, but you do have the ability to chat. So please pop open your chat window and engage with us. Please say hello, tell us where you're dialing in from, and maybe where your closest Hawkwatch is. Say hello, and most importantly, use that chat to ask your questions of Becca. And as always, Julie Brown will facilitate that Q&A at the end. So speaking of the famous Julie Brown, I'm going to turn things over to her. She will introduce Becca, and we'll get things going. So Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Josh. I'm Julie Brown, and I'm the Raptor Migration and Programs Director at HMANA. I hope everybody can see Becca's screen here. There was somebody who was having an issue seeing a blank screen, but I think it's working for others, so hopefully they have some luck with that. I just wanted to mention that we started Lunch and Learn in June 2020, so this many years later, we're still doing it. This is kind of our anniversary month. And I'm so happy that we're continuing to bring these great programs to you guys. It's a great way to connect with all of you. So we're excited, as Josh said, to have Becca here to talk about Broadwings. We had Lori, her colleague, Lori Goodrich, speak back in December 2020, and I know this project is going strong, and you've been learning a lot since then, lots of new findings. So we're excited to hear what you're learning. So Rebecca received her BS in environmental biology at Millersville University, and then earned her MS in biology at East Stroudsburg University, studying the nesting behavior of broadwing hawks in Pennsylvania. In December 2021, Rebecca defended her Ph.D. research at McGill University, studying snowy owl ecology and survival rate in winter, which research suggests is a critical time in the species' life. Rebecca joined the staff full-time at Hawk Mountain in May 2021, serving as one of the sanctuary's biologists. She continues researching broadwing hawks and snowy owls and is involved in the sanctuary's long-term American Kestrel project. She also assists with other various aspects of conservation science, including the trainee program, advising undergraduate and graduate students, and science education outreach. So thanks for taking the time to be with us today, Rebecca.
Well, thanks, Julie, for the very kind introduction, and a big hello to everyone. I'm excited to be here and present at my first HMANA Lunch Learn. This is really exciting. And I'm pleased to share with you all the really cool research that we're doing here at Hawk Mountain on one of my favorite long-distance migrants. And so, as you skilled hawk watchers here in the Western Hemisphere already know, the broadwing hawk really needs no introduction. But maybe for those of you that are new to hawk watching and you're still learning your North American raptor species, the broadwing hawk is a small, stocky raptor, similar in size to our American crow. And they have that typical buteo shape with those broad, flat wings and dark trailing edges on their wings. And for adult birds, they have this distinct broad white and black tailband seen here on this individual in flight. And for those of you that are out hiking the forests in the spring and summer months, you may recognize that high-pitched whistle of the broad-winged hawk. So during the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere, broad-winged hawks breed throughout southern Canada and eastern and central United States, seen here as red on this map. And as long-distance complete migrants, the entire breeding population will vacate their breeding area and migrate south down into southern Mexico, Central, and South America, seen here as blue on this map. And broad-winged hawks are known for their large kettles that are formed during migration. It's a spectacular sight to see at hawk watches throughout their range, especially at the Veracruz River Raptors watch site in Veracruz, Mexico. And this bottleneck, they count over 1.9 million broadwings each autumn, which is absolutely incredible. So here at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, we don't get that number of broadwings, but we do count about 20,000 raptors as they fly south each autumn, and nearly half of those are broad-winged hawks. And broad-wing flights draw in large crowds to the lookouts, which is a great time to get out to your local hawk watch site to see some cool birds passing over and possibly make a few new friends. And so although this is one of our most numerous migrants, the broadwing has been showing declines at hawkwatch sites throughout the eastern part of its range. So the Raptor Population Index, also known as RPI, is a collaborative effort between HMANA, Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Hawkwatch International, and Birds Canada. And the whole goal of RPI is to understand and share trends and the conservation status of our migratory raptors here in North America. And so the website has these great maps that you can go and look for individual species and check out the different hawkwatch sites. But this map here is showing 10-year trends for broadwing hawks at our hawkwatch sites in North America. And so we can see the hawkwatch sites that have those red arrows, declining arrows, that's showing that these sites are showing significant declines of broadwing hawks at their hawkwatch sites. And then the arrows in green are showing increases in broadwing hawk numbers at those hawkwatch sites. All the little dots of blue, those are just other hawkwatch sites that don't have 10-year trend data for this species yet. So we're seeing declines in areas at hawkwatch sites in the eastern part of their range. But one of my favorite things about studying broadwings is that they gather in these large kettles during migration, creating quite the spectacle. But then during the breeding period, they're super challenging to observe due to their camouflage in the forest and their secretive behavior. So for example, to the untrained eye, an active broadwing hawk nest can be difficult to spot. So all three of these photos here show active nests, but one here shows the piercing eye of an adult glaring back at you. So in addition to declining trends at hawkwatch sites in the east, there have also been reported declines of nesting in some states and provinces throughout their range. So for example, here in the state of Pennsylvania, nesting has declined by 16% since the 1980s. And this is based on the Pennsylvania Breeding Bird Atlas data. And so more specifically on this map, we can see declines in the southern regions of the state. So all of these yellow blocks are indicating areas that once had active broadwing hawk nests in the 1980s, but were not active or confirmed in the 2000 Breeding Bird Atlas. So with reported declines during migration and the breeding period, Hawk Mountain decided to launch a full annual cycle study in 2014. My fabulous colleague and mentor, Dr. Lori Goodrich, acquired some funding from the Pennsylvania Game Commission and private donations to launch this research project on broad-winged hawks. And so by launching a full annual cycle study, our goal was to better understand their ecology in both the breeding and non-breeding periods, and to determine what factors could be influencing these regional declines that we were seeing at both hawkwatch sites and nest sites. But before we could start answering such questions, we first had to find the birds and their nests in the wild. And so this entails going out into the woods in areas where historical nests or eBird sightings were reported. And as we walk through the forest, we're constantly looking up with our binoculars for these stick nests in the crotch of a tree. And here you can see one that was in the process of being built in the end of April. And so once we find a potential stick nest that's been identified, we'll return at a later date to confirm that the nest is indeed active by a broad-winged hawk. And so once nests are found and confirmed active, we'll monitor them weekly to note the development of the young, note any disturbances or failures at the nest. In addition to monitoring the nests, one of our main goals is also to follow up with banded individuals. And this allows us to estimate return rates and survivorship using resightings of color banded individuals or telemetry-tracked birds. And so, super exciting news. This morning, Laurie and I went out to one of our historical nest sites. She found the nest yesterday and we put a scope on it, confirmed it was indeed a broad-winged hawk. And we banded a bird in that area back in July 2020. And we were fortunate enough to have the female hop off the nest, perch right above the nest on this branch here. And you can see that the bird has a band on it. And so we were thrilled to confirm that this individual is indeed still alive and nesting in the territory. So it was a good day for us today. And just to give you an idea of where some of the nests are that we monitor here in Pennsylvania are located. There we have Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, and we have nests that we monitor on our neighboring game lands, on the sanctuary lands, and then in some southeast region of the state. We have nests that are on county lands, state park lands, private lands, and state game lands. So a mix of areas of where these birds are nesting and that we have access to those nests. We also have our wonderful colleagues in both Connecticut and New Hampshire that are monitoring nests in their regions as well. So during the breeding season, we assess various behaviors such as prey and nest material deliveries and the amount of time that adults will spend at the nest. We use both on-the-ground field observations, and in the past, we've used nest cameras. We also look at habitat characteristics at both the micro and macro scale, such as what nest tree species are they nesting in, what's the land cover type surrounding their nests. And so we're using in-the-field measurements and GIS software to do those analyses. And then just to give you an idea, here in Pennsylvania, the birds are returning around mid-April. They immediately start building their nests. Then in May, they'll start incubating their eggs. By middle of June, we'll have nestlings. And by the middle of July, the young are already ready to fledge. And so broad-winged hawks are also generalists, so they eat a variety of prey items. In a study we published back in 2019, we observed broad-winged hawk adults delivering about 38% of prey to their young that were made up of small mammals. About 16% of that was eastern chipmunks, a nice hearty meal to give to your babies. We also had 18% of their prey being delivered being small birds, and about 11% being your reptiles and amphibians. And so, as I mentioned, we're also collecting data on the nest attributes. So are the birds selecting certain species? We're finding that they're nesting in a variety of tree species, from your chestnut, red, and white oaks, tulip trees, white pines, black cherries, and gums, and birch trees. We're also looking at the DBH of the tree species, the nest height, and then of course monitoring how many young fledge from those nests. And on average, we're seeing about 2 fledglings per nest. So then to switch gears and assess those behaviors outside of the breeding period, we use telemetry to learn about the habitats and the threats these birds face throughout the non-breeding period. And so this is the aspect that I'll kind of focus on for the rest of the talk this afternoon. And so we often get asked, how do we go about trapping these hawks? So I always like to include this in my talks and just kind of want to take a few minutes to walk you through what it's like to trap a broad-winged hawk. And so we usually go out to the nest site once the young are about a week and a half, 2 weeks old. This is a time when the adults tend to be a little bit more aggressive and territorial, and so they'll defend their nest more. And we go in with mist nets, seen here on the left, and we set those up right around the nest tree. And we'll set the mist nets up surrounding a decoy. And that decoy is a predator that you'll see on the next slide. So these nets are almost invisible to the bird, and they have pockets in them. So as the bird is diving in on that predator decoy, it gets caught in one of the nets, and we're able to run out and safely retrieve it from the nets. We also use one of our camouflage pop-up blinds so that we can stay really close to the nets. That way, as soon as the bird gets caught, we can get it in the hand. And so here is our really cool decoy bird that we have. Oftentimes in raptor trapping, they can use a live great horned owl. We have opted for a mechanical great horned owl. It is a taxidermied owl, so very lifelike. And this really aggravates the broad-winged hawks and gets them upset because great horned owls are predators to other raptors, including broadwings, and so they get very defensive. And I'll just give you a little tease of Robo Owl in action. And so you can see that its head swivels and its wings flap. And once you bring a bird in and you make those motions, it's very lifelike and increases your chances of having the broadwing come down and dive the owl. And then here's just a short video, courtesy of Phil Brown, who was in the blind with me that day. And this just kind of gives you a view inside the blind that we get to see when we're trying to trap the birds. And so we're in the pop-up blind. I'm there with my remote control, working the owl. The mist nets are up, but you can't see them from this video. And then you'll see the owl and hear our call as well that we're using. All right, so if we're fortunate, we'll get a bird in the nets. And then once we get that bird in hand, our goal is to gather as much information as we can about that individual. So what we'll do is we'll take a series of measurements, wing chord, tail length, we'll look at the fat, we'll look at the crop, we'll band the bird with both USGS aluminum bands and then as well as our own color bands so we can recite that individual at a later date. We'll look at molt scores. And then once we have all that information, if that individual is eligible for a transmitter, it has to be of an appropriate weight. We would then put on a transmitter. And so we're currently using about 9-gram GPS tracking devices. We've used satellite in the past. And again, these are affixed in that typical backpack harness method, which a lot of other researchers are using as well. And so the idea is that this device is lightweight. It sits on the back of the bird and just sits like a backpack. And so minimal disturbance to the bird. We've seen over the years of doing this, birds copulating, returning to nest, having young, and it's seeming like it has very little effects on these long distance migrants. So since 2014, we've been deploying telemetry units on broadwings in Pennsylvania, 12 of which have provided complete tracking data for the breeding, migratory, and wintering periods. And then with continued support from donors and grants and collaborators, we've expanded our study into Connecticut, deploying 3 transmitters in 2021, and then New Hampshire with 5 transmitters during the last 2 years, and Canada with an additional 5 transmitters on birds from Ontario. Okay, so the really cool stuff. What are we learning by affixing these tiny GPS trackers to these long distance migrants? And so I thought I would use our New Hampshire birds as an example, just because it gets a little busy when you start to add, 20 birds to a map. But just to give you an idea of timing of migration, so we had these 3 individuals, Thelma, Harris, and Monadnock, which were all tagged in the Hancock region of New Hampshire. Thelma and Monadnock were adult females, and Harris was an adult male. And they all started initiating spring migration between September 15th and September 18th. And then they all started to pass Veracruz, Mexico around that 2nd and 3rd week of October. And they arrived on their wintering grounds as early as October 25th and as late as November 27th. And so I like to share this little example of Harris and Thelma. As I mentioned, they both were from the same region of Hancock, New Hampshire. And so they nested only about 10 kilometers from one another during the summer of 2021. So they were neighbors. And they both had 2 nestlings. However, unfortunately, Thelma's nest did fail. But they both started migration within a few days of each other. And actually, Harris reached his wintering grounds the earliest, as you can see here on the map. He wintered in Antioquia, Colombia, and he arrived on October 25th. And Thelma continued traveling all the way down into Pará, Brazil, and she arrived about a 1 month later than Harris onto her wintering grounds. So they wintered 2,500 kilometers apart, which is absolutely kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, because this whole idea of maybe birds from certain regions breeding in the same area and wintering in the same area doesn't seem to be the case with examples like this. And so for spring migration, we saw that they started initiating in early to late March. And then arrived back on their breeding grounds in the later half of April and early May. And so also, which was really cool to see, is as Thelma started to migrate out of Brazil, it wasn't till about the time she reached Colombia, where Harris was wintering, that he also started migrating. And so there was a little bit of a lag, but then once she reached his latitude, they both started to take off and head through Central America. So the following fall, we added 2 more birds to our sample size. One, Monadnock, did her transmitter failed, and so we don't have tracking data for her for a 2nd season, but we can see that they initiated migration around the same time again, so September 15th through the 16th. And they passed Veracruz again around the same time, slightly earlier this season than last. And so I just wanted to show a couple of maps here as we progressed over time. And so this was the autumn migration for 2021 for those individuals that we tagged. So you can see, again, where the birds are nesting and then their migratory routes as they come down into Mexico, Central America, and sort of disperse coming out into South America. Again, in 2022, that was the year that we had the most birds actively transmitting. We had 7 newly tagged birds and 4 returning, giving us a total of 11 birds being tracked last autumn. And that was really exciting because I think it was engaging for people who were following along. We were able to see the different paths they were taking and the timing, and to see sort of kind of guessing when they would be arriving on their wintering grounds. And so all in all, it seems that take the birds about anywhere from 80 to 100 days to migrate during autumn migration. And so, as I mentioned, they're arriving on their wintering grounds from late October. We've had some actually arrive on their wintering grounds in early January. And so when you think about that, it's pretty amazing because these birds are spending a lot of their time on migration. So if they're leaving in September and they're not arriving on their wintering grounds until early January, and then they have to pick up and leave again in March, it's not much time that they're staying stationary. We published a study with our colleagues from the Smithsonian's Migratory Connectivity Project and the University of Alberta a couple of years ago in the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, looking at migration ecology of Alberta versus Pennsylvania birds. We found that the broadwing hawks tagged in our study wintered in 10 different countries, as far north as Mexico and as far south as Bolivia. And one thing that we're seeing by tracking broadwing hawks is that they are showing strong site fidelity to their wintering areas. So they're returning both to their the same breeding areas, but also to the same wintering areas. And so Frankie is a really great example showing strong site fidelity to a wintering site. And so Frankie was an adult female breeding in Connecticut and wintered in Costa Rica for the last 2 years in a row. And one of our great collaborators in Connecticut, Larry Fisher, reached out to us saying his friend Judy was also wintering in Costa Rica and that she was willing to kind of scope out Frankie's wintering site so we could learn more about the habitat. And this is an amazing thing about this type of project is that for us, it's very challenging to pick up and follow these birds, right? Following them down on their migration and then going to their wintering site. Often people will ask us, well, why don't you go down to their wintering grounds? And some of these birds are wintering in the Amazon. And when I think about going out onto Hawk Mountain Sanctuary and finding a broadwing in such a small area to then going to the Amazon with such lush forest and finding these birds would just be really challenging. So it's amazing to connect with people from those regions and have them sort of show us what the birds are showing. And so, as we expected from the satellite imagery and our tracking data, Frankie was actually wintering in a palm oil plantation. And so you can see here on this map, we have a few fixes from the first winter, but then all of the green dots are the fixes from this past winter. And you can see that almost complete overlap. So going back to that same little patch of palm plantation. And what was cool was during that visit, they were able to take some photos for us so we could see firsthand what Frankie was seeing. And she mentioned that there was newly planted and cut palm oil plantations and a few small neighborhoods in the region. And it was really, really cool because after looking at Frankie's GPS data, we confirmed that she actually departed her wintering site the morning that Judy came to visit. And so she didn't end up seeing any broadwing hawks. And that makes sense because Frankie already was, I think, like 66 kilometers north by the time Judy arrived at this site. So some pretty wild timing there. So here we have See You Home. This was another adult female tagged in Connecticut. And we have 2 years of tracking data from her. And she came back and forested in a wintering site in La Guajira, Colombia. And she wintered just like a very short flight. I think it was less than a kilometer from the Venezuelan border. And we could see that she went back to that same area the following year. And what's really interesting about See You Home is that this is the only Hawk Mountain broadwing that we tagged that flew east after departing the bottleneck of Panama. So that was really interesting because most of the birds come out and sort of go west and south into Brazil and Peru. But we did have 2 birds from our collaborators at the University of Alberta and Smithsonian that we collaborated with. They tagged those 3 birds from Alberta, Canada, and 2 of the 3 went west, actually. So one wintered in Venezuela and the other wintered in Suriname. Hugger is another individual. Hugger was an adult female, or is an adult female that we captured in Canada, likely breeding in the area. We were road trapping and were able to catch this female. And she actually wintered in Guatemala. And from her movement data, we can see actually that it was early October, I believe, that she actually did a small stopover in a park outside of Guatemala City before settling on her wintering grounds. So just as we expected, these birds are using forests and green spaces during migration, stopping over, roosting, but it just goes to show how important these green spaces are for these migrant birds as they're coming into heavily populated areas. So Muskoka is another bird that we tagged in Ontario, an adult female. And Muskoka started migrating, I think, around the 15th or 16th of September. And less than 2 months later, she arrived at her wintering site. And well, we're not really sure, actually. Muskoka had some really interesting movements because from our tracking data, we can see that she attempted to settle around, I think it was November 8th in Brazil. But actually, when we zoomed in on her movement data, we could see that actually the satellite imagery was showing that this area was heavily agricultural. So you can see here from this map, this is all the forest in green, and then all of these sort of hatched areas in brown is agricultural. And so Muskoka kind of moved around using these small patches of remaining forest. So kind of like hopping around to the different forests. And then she flew north and then south again. And we have a little bit of gaps in our movement data, but we think that she really actually didn't settle on her wintering site until early January. And that ended up being in Bolivia. And so a little over 2 months later, she was already starting her northbound movements. So again, pretty incredible thinking about how much time these birds are on the move, and then really getting us a more in-depth look at what's going on when they're down in South America and sort of how they're navigating those changes in the environment. And I was super curious when I looked at this and said, okay, I want to know what's going on there in this region of Brazil. There's got to be some information about the forest. And so I searched something, and then Global Forest Watch popped up, and they have this really cool interactive map where you can zoom into areas and see how forest loss has changed over time. And so what I did is created a little polygon of that area where she was moving around and didn't really settle. And that's that black polygon you'll see on your screen there. And so I'll hit the map, and what you'll see is from the early 2000s to 2021, forest loss happening, which we'll just see that get more and more pink as time goes on. And so really interesting to see that this clearly is impacting the birds in some way, causing them to move, potentially finding a new wintering site. But I think I read the statistic that that area between Bolivia and Brazil lost over 150 kilohectares, so thousands of hectares of tree cover, which was equivalent to 28% decrease in tree cover loss since the early 2000s. So definitely seeing some impact there on the birds. So I also wanted to share this kind of blurry screenshot here. We do have an interactive map that we share with the public. If you go to www.hawkmountain.org/birdtracker, it's this really cool interactive mapping tool that you can zoom in on each individual of the birds, see their migratory routes, see where they stopped over, see where they're wintering. There's a little calendar as well, so you can move through time and see where the bird was, if it was passing over your Hawkwatch site, maybe it passed over your house, did it stop over nearby? And so it's a really cool feature that we're really happy to be able to share this information with the public as an educational tool, and to hopefully get people excited about broadwing hawks and migration. If you go to it right now, it is not active, and that's only because we keep it offline while the birds are breeding, just to protect the location of their nests and not cause any disturbance. So check back in late August and it should be up and running. So another really great thing about having a project, reaching almost 10 years of being active and being here at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, we get so passionate and just excited young conservationists who kind of want to help out and are interested in what these birds are doing. And one of those was Sandra, and Sandra was a conservation science trainee here in 2019. And she's from Peru, and she loves raptors and felt sort of connected to broadwings because they were wintering in her home country. And so she decided to analyze all of our wintering data at the time for our broadwing hawks. And so she was able to lead and publish a paper in the Journal of Raptor Research a few years ago, looking at the landscape composition and the threats to these wintering areas of our tagged birds. And so I believe this was the first study to analyze land cover composition and threats to wintering areas of broadwing hawks. And what we found was that their wintering areas were dominated by submontane and lowland evergreen forests. And so you can see here, this is a map of one individual that wintered in Colombia. And these areas of the black polygon are showing the wintering area. And then we can see the different types of land cover overlaid with that. And so the areas in white are urban, areas in gray are forested, and then this little pattern here is showing protected areas, so that we're seeing that this individual stayed away from those urban environments and wintered in an area that had both forest and protected lands. So showing the importance of those land cover types. We did find that over 86% of the birds that we tagged in our study were impacted by deforestation and forest fires. And so looking at those different land cover types, we can see, again, like how I showed you in those examples before, with Muskoka being a great example of how changes in the landscape are impacting these birds and could potentially cause them to shift their ranges a bit or possibly be detrimental and cause the bird to not survive. We also found some indication of overlap with illegal mining in Peru for some of our birds as well. So their wintering ranges overlapped with areas of illegal mining. Another great, passionate former conservation science trainee, Diego Gallego. He was just here last spring and again is doing his PhD now, and so is Sandra. So they're both really interested in movement ecology, and he really took to, again, the work that we're doing with broadwings. And so he decided that he would like to look at the home range data. So when the birds are on their breeding sites and looking at site fidelity, as well as the effects of sex and nest productivity and ecoregion on their home ranges. And so it's really cool from the study thus far. He just submitted this paper, so it's currently in review, but I'm giving you a little sneak peek of that. But what we found that males had 20 times larger home range sizes during the breeding period than females. So females averaged 2.8 square kilometers was their breeding home range. And then males, it was about 60 square kilometers. So much larger for the males, which again, makes sense biologically. The females are tending to the young, they're sitting on eggs, then they're brooding the young, and they're staying close to the nest and defending, whereas the males are out hunting for both the female and the young. And here's just a cool map showing from our tracking data, we can see how their home ranges are overlapping. And so I mentioned that strong site fidelity to both the breeding and the wintering periods. And so we did have a couple individuals that we had multiple years of tracking data for. And so this was really great. So we could say, okay, their nest site moved, but the area that they were using around their nest site didn't change much. There was home range overlapped. I think it was a little over 80% in all cases. And so we also found that the interannual nest distances, so for those of you that don't know, broadwing hawks, especially in our region, tend to not reuse the same nest. So they'll find a different nest tree, build a new nest every year. And so we're trying to understand how that shift changes each year. And we found that on average, they're moving their nest about 200 meters. So it varies depending on what else is going on in the environment, if there's other birds moving in, other predators, but on average, it seems like they're moving their nests about 200 meters. So what is next for the project? We are all very happy to see that it's continuing and generating support and people are getting excited. I will admit that 11 years ago, I did not know what a broad-winged hawk was, and now it feels very crazy to be at this point and being all consumed by them and learning so much about them. And so it's exciting to share that information with other people and hopefully get other people excited about this species that I think is sometimes underrated outside of the hawk watching migration world. Most people don't know that, you know, they're in the forest next to their house. So We're going to continue following up with our banded and telemetry tagged birds. As I mentioned, we want to be able to assess survival. How long is a broadwing, coming back to the same territory, potentially mating with the same individual, the same pair, how long are they together for? We also want to keep analyzing breeding and non-breeding movement data. As I mentioned in the beginning, we were using satellite transmitters, which had a little bit more of an error associated with their fixes. We didn't get as many fixes. Now we've switched to GPS, GSM, and so we're getting more fixes, greater precision on those fixes. And so we're just learning a lot more about these birds as the technology advances as well. We're also really excited to partner with the Vermont Institute of Natural Sciences. Lori and I are headed up to Vermont next week to team up with them and hopefully trap 1 to 3 individuals and put tracking devices on adult females up there. We've also had some support from the Birds Canada Bailey Fund and Bird Protection Quebec to put some transmitters on birds in Quebec after we leave Vermont. So we're hoping all goes well for that and we can add some more birds to our list from new regions. And then we're thinking big for the future. We're hoping to potentially do some work in Florida. Not a lot is known about the Florida birds and what happens, how do those birds get down to the tip of Florida? And then are they coming back year after year? And so we're interested in doing some work there, as well as moving to the far western part of their breeding range up in British Columbia. So we're also continuing to collaborate with former Hawk Mountain trainees and current graduate students. We have, again, an amazing group of people that continue to come through Hawk Mountain's doors that are excited about raptor conservation and raptor research. And so we're working with Gabby and Natia, who are both finishing up their master's research, and Addie, who is in the middle of her Ph.D. research, and they're all using whether it's nest site data or tracking data for their graduate research. So it's really exciting to be collaborating with them. Also, from the tracking data, we're learning new things that we didn't know before. One thing we kind of want to expand our knowledge on are these pre-migratory movements. We saw this when we first started tagging birds. In the beginning of the project here in Pennsylvania, we had 3 adult females show these pre-migratory movements. So they left their nest area and moved X distance. I think we had 45 kilometers on average for these 3 individuals here shown on this graph. And they kind of hung out in this area before they started making those southbound movements. So we thought, interesting, okay, we'll, not think much of it, we'll document it and, move on to the migration component. And then we continued tagging more birds and we found sort of more of these extreme movements. And I really want to highlight these individuals, the New Hampshire birds, because they kind of blew us away with these pre-migratory movements. And so Monadnock is the individual in blue on your screen. And all 3 of these, again, were tagged in collaboration with the Harris Center for Conservation Education and Phil and Julie. And we put trackers on the birds in July and June, and then started to see these birds kind of make these non-southward movements. And so Monadnock left her breeding grounds August 19th, and she traveled 257 kilometers to Richford, Vermont. And so we were like, wow, that's incredible. She's going north before she goes on this really long journey south into South America. And then Nubanuset did the same thing, again, left the nest site around August 18th and then stayed there until about September 14th, traveling in total of 212 kilometers to New York. And then Skatutikee, which again just blew us away, left fairly early August, and then stayed didn't start migrating until September 14th. And she traveled over 500 kilometers to Latuque, Quebec. And so trying to understand what these movements are all about and why the birds might be doing this, and these locations that they're going to, are they consistently going there year after year? Are these natal grounds? What's going on? What is the benefit to the birds doing this? my thought is that they're leaving, their nest area, which now has young, and those young are then, they want their young to survive and eat, and they don't want to compete with them for prey. And so they go and do these pre-migratory movements to these other areas where they can feed and sort of rest and refuel before they head on this long journey south. And so a lot more to come from this, because it's all very new for us and exciting to see. And we've only seen this in females thus far. We haven't tagged as many males. And so we're curious to see if males are also doing this, or if it's just females. And so again, more things, we just keep having more questions come up as the more birds you tag and the interesting behaviors that come up. So this was an interesting example. We're kind of curious about how weather and sort of flocking behavior might be influencing migration. And these are two individuals that were tagged in Canada, and as they were flying north on spring migration, they kind of came up through Illinois and then hit Wisconsin. And then instead of kind of continuing northeast into Indiana, like the way they came, this is the route they came south on, they went up into Wisconsin. And so it was interesting to see, we're like, what are they going to do? How are they going to navigate around the Great Lakes? Muskoka, this bird here in red, kind of went north up towards Milwaukee and then turned around, flying back down south to the southern tip of Lake Michigan, and then made its kind of way back through Michigan and into Ontario. So figured it out pretty quickly, I would say. However, Jennifer, the bird with the brown tracking data here, she really kind of took a long time to find her bearings. And as we were watching this sort of live unfold, really confused as what was going on. And so she flew north and then flew south and then flew north again, and then got all the way to Washington Island, Michigan. And she did make a small water crossing, just under 10 kilometers. But then she ended up turning around, going south back towards Milwaukee, before finally getting it right 10 days later. And then instead of going down to the southern tip, she actually went up through the UP. And so we were there sitting there kind of scratching our heads of like, what's going on? Why is the bird doing this? And, just a lot more to learn about that. So we didn't really dive into the weather, or again, did anyone see, kettles of broadwings going over, and did they just kind of get off course? One really big thing we're trying to do with this project and by tracking these birds is learn about the birds themselves, but we also want to share that with everybody else. We've been doing our best on the conservation education front to try to collaborate. We've partnered with Audubon and the Nature Conservancy, sharing our tracking data. We've created a curriculum both in English and in Spanish to engage with students and allow them to use the tracking data and learn about the areas that these birds are going to as they're traveling. We do have a Facebook page that we're engaging with people on social media and try to get them excited about broadwings and migration. And so it's really great to see it sort of spreading out and not just something that we're using for ourselves. Again, as I mentioned before, another really cool thing that comes from this is connecting with people in other areas that these birds are using. And so one of our board members, Anna, she actually is from Colombia, and she was able to spread the word and get out and have other people get out to the wintering areas of Harris. And they went out and took photos and wrote about the habitat types, and were able to just share that information, and got really excited that there was a bird that was breeding in the US and wintering in their country. And it was just like a really cool connection linking us all together. And so Anna wrote a blog about it in both English and Spanish. Again, we're trying our best to be bilingual here because these birds are traveling in English and Spanish speaking countries, and Portuguese. And so, yeah, I just kind of want to wrap up here and bring it all home in that the International Union for Conservation of Nature has the broadwing listed of least concern. So there's no immediate threat to their population. But I do think it's very fitting to study broadwing hawks here at Hawk Mountain, because as our founder, Rosalie Edge, is famously known for her quote, "The time to protect a species is while it is still common." And I very much agree with her on that. And of course, to study a species throughout its full annual cycle, it's a massive effort, and we couldn't do this kind of work without our incredible network of volunteers, landowners, field assistants, project collaborators, Hawk Mountain trainees, and so many others. This is truly one of the best parts about doing a project of this scale, is getting to work with so many wonderful people who not only have a love for this species and other raptors, but for nature and wildlife in general. And so a big thank you to all of our donors and funders and sponsors. And I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was amazing. Really phenomenal research. And I'm just fascinated to see how much you're able to learn, how much, really in-depth information you guys are gathering from all seasons. It blows my mind. I really love seeing the wintering, the forest types of the kind of places these birds are spending the winter blows my mind. And I feel like you're just really uncovering information that's going to be so valuable. We have a ton of questions, so I will dive in and keep, if others have questions, please keep adding it to the chat. Let me go back to the first. Okay, Alan, his first question is, for the female broadwing confirmed this morning, was the band able to be read through the scope, or was it just assumed that it was likely the same bird banded in 2020?
Good question. So we were able to get the scope on it, and I was able to read the first 4 numbers. The thing too is we also only tagged 3 birds over time at that site, and that was the only individual to have the USGS band on the right leg. So we were able to confirm that that was definitely her, even though she did pull off her color bands. So we have switched over to new kinds of color bands that are a little bit more durable. The small plastic ones we were using, they seemed to break and the birds pulled them off. So we are confident based on the 4 numbers that I read and the leg that band was on, that it's the same individual.
Cool. Okay. Another question from Alan. He was wondering which bird was giving that harsh gurgling call heard in the blind video. Was that a crow or a broadwing?
Yeah, it's funny, this tape has just been passed along. It's a cassette tape actually of the great horned owl call, and what we assume is some very angry crows. I don't know, but maybe somebody else would know. But yes, it's haunting.
Okay. Jerry is wondering, could you please describe your harness type that you use?
Yes, so we use the backpack style harness. We have in the past used Teflon, but we've switched over to Spectra. And those 2 types of material are non-abrasive. So when they sit on the bird's body, under the feathers, it's just kind of like very slippery, kind of like silk. And then we use a leather harness to kind of cross over, and then we tie our knots in the back that way. So I don't know if that's enough of detail there, but if he has more questions, feel free to email me.
That's great. Okay, Eric is asking, do broadwings take a new mate every year?
That's a good question. And so it's really challenging for us. Julie, you've experienced it one time where we were able, I guess it's been 2 times, able to trap both individuals at the nest. We try our best with the transmitters. We're aiming for adult females right now. And so we have a time in the breeding period where we tend to get them more than the males. And so if we have one individual banded, we know for certain that is a returning bird. But if the other one is unbanded, we really don't know because they look so similar. And if you have 2 males next to each other, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the 2. So unless both have been banded, that's the only way for us to know.
Okay. Next question is from Anthony. Are there any centers in El Salvador that are involved in research, monitoring, and/or education that you know of?
That's a good question. We have actually through our Facebook, because this has sort of gotten shared far and wide, had people reach out to us from rehab facilities actually in Central and South America that say, hey, we have a injured bird, or would you be interested in tagging it? And so I'm sure there has to be some facilities down there education wise that is at least aware and sharing information about the broadwing, but studying them directly, not to our knowledge.
Okay, thanks. David's wondering, did you learn anything about feeding habits of broadwings? How can birds migrating in such large groups find adequate food?
That's a dream. I would love to go to these roost sites or these areas while they're migrating. Because I just envision and reading about this in a paper that like a whole tree can just be like covered in broadwings as they're roosting. But I imagine, when they're coming down in some of these stopover sites, finding prey, especially as you go south, is much easier, right? So maybe you're picking off things like snakes and frogs instead of small mammals. But yeah, it would be something I would love to spend time learning more about, because it's hard to know anything from just looking at tracking data. You have to be on the ground and see those observations. So
I'll do that with you. We can form a team. I'm very interested in that question too.
I like that.
Let's see. Next question is from Dawn. Are the fires in Ontario affecting any of your tagged birds?
Yes. I was speaking with our collaborators up there, Charlotte England and Malcolm Wilson, and because the birds returned and their transmitters are still working, and we know the birds are nesting, but it seems like they're much further south, so they're just north of Toronto. And so it seems like all is okay right now, but of course other broadwing hawks that are in those regions, I'm sure, are being impacted by the fires.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is from Ajit. Can adult broadwings have pale eyes? The ones you recited today had pale eyes. Should be an adult since you caught it in July 2020 originally. So it's at least 3 or more years old. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the eye color is interesting, and we've been documenting that for the last couple of years now, because for like accipiters, we know that their eye color, gets darker with age, and broadwings, we've seen just quite a bit of variation, and it's really like half of their eye is light and the other half is dark. So we're trying to get better at documenting that and seeing how that changes over time by retrapping a bird later on, or again assessing the bird's age with using molt, and to see if there is any indication that the eye color darkens or changes as the bird ages. But we don't have that information just yet. So
okay. From Sandy, are these data being used to support habitat protection for hawks that you know of?
Yeah, so Audubon is using some of those data, and we do, I mentioned one of the grad students, Addie, who's doing her PhD in Mexico. She's actually using a multi-species approach, looking at stopovers in Mexico, Central and South America. So seeing, if there's differences in the stopover sites among species, or if they're sort of using some of the same areas. And then ideally, we're thinking that will be information that we can share with the management to say, hey, these are important areas for these migrating species. And so we're doing our best to put that information out there with, reports and sharing that information with other organizations that are also doing their best to preserve these important areas. But yeah, we're hopeful that it's getting to the right people.
Yeah. Well, Steve's question is, what do we know about survival of either or both adults and juveniles?
Yeah, so we attempted to look at survival and also the migration in the early years, and with just, again, in general, raptors having such a high mortality rate in their first year of life, and these technologies also being quite expensive, we haven't found the happy medium yet, but that is something we would love to be able to do in the future when the transmitter costs can come down and we could put these on more young to assess, post-fledgling survival and then annual survival. We're not quite there yet. For survival studies, it does take, multiple years. And even though we're almost at 10 years, we're still not quite there yet. And we're doing our best. Like I mentioned, the bird this morning that we recited, we weren't able to confirm it in 2021 or 2022. So even though it was nesting in the same area, I mean, to get these birds to perch in that right spot and to see their legs and confirm that they're back, it can be quite challenging. So if anyone has suggestions on other ways to assess survival, let us know. But we got new bands, and we're hoping, transmitter life, again, is not very long for these birds. Again, these transmitters are small in comparison to what people are using on, eagles and snowy owls. They can be, they can have a lifespan of, 5 to 10 years or more. We're lucky if we get 3 years out of these. So.
Wow. Yeah. Really speaks to the importance of long-term monitoring so we can answer all these questions.
Most definitely.
Okay, next question. We're coming, it's about 1:00. So are you okay with a couple more questions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
If we go a few minutes over? Okay,
Sure.
These are great questions. Michael is asking, about 20 years ago, Kirk Moulton did a study called Broadwing September that followed broadwing migration from Pennsylvania to Texas. Has any of that work been repeated? And if yes, has there been any significant route changes? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I'm not. Actually, that would be definitely worth looking into. And I guess you're sort of saying, like, over time, maybe with sort of development or just any changes in their migratory paths. I'm not sure, and that would be something that would be really interesting to read about and see. And that's, I think, what would be really cool is, if we are still tracking these birds 50 years from now, to have that sort of long-term data to see how things are really shifting based on weather patterns and how the birds are sort of optimizing their migration. So yeah.
Right. And how quickly we're seeing forest changes as well.
Exactly.
Another
and if
huge
they're
factor.
needing forest on migration to stop over or to roost, and if that's starting to change, then are they going to shift their routes? I would think so, but we'll see how they adapt.
Okay, Chad is wondering, is there a reason that your study was limited to birds east of the Great Lakes? Peak broadwing migration occurs between September 16th and 23rd in south central Minnesota, which is when your eastern birds are just initiating migration. We hypothesize that western populations may travel west of Lake Superior typically, but that prevailing winds can push those birds over the Great Lakes to pass through Detroit River in some years.
Right. Yeah. So the only reason, we focused more on the East is because we're based here. And so we started in Pennsylvania, and we honestly thought that this was going to be a 2 to 3 year project. But with more funding and people getting engaged in private donations, we were able to keep expanding. And then again, having amazing collaborators who are willing to get out and look for nests, which is very time consuming. Phil can speak to that. And Julie, you've gone out as well, that it just takes a lot of work. And to our knowledge, not a lot of people, again, are studying this species. So, that's why we're in Ontario, is because we have collaborators up there who actually found this amazing hotspot when the birds are coming back from their wintering grounds, and they do this stopover area in the Muskokas, and they're able to road trap broadwings, which is not something we're capable of doing here. It's much more challenging, but up in that area, it's heavily forested. There's forest roads that you can drive on, and they use a Balchatri trap, and they just drop it and get a bird like that. And so actually it's an amazing feat. This past spring, they were able to trap and band their 500th broadwing hawk in the last couple of years. And so finding them and being able to team up with them was an amazing thing. And we're still working with them and collaborating with them. And so if there's more interest in other parts of their range, we would love to be able to collaborate with people. But as I mentioned, it's a huge effort and can be very costly. And we just kind of have to know the right people who are willing to help.
Okay. I think we have a few more questions, but I think I'll just probably wrap it up with this last one because we're getting past 1 o'clock. Trudy's wondering, so spring migration data should be better correlated with populations than fall migration data?
In what sense?
I'm not sure. We can't, I could try to find Trudy and unmute her. I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Let me,
like, because the birds are surviving the fall migration and winter period and then returning north. I'm not sure.
Sorry,
I'm not either. If anybody else knows what she meant. But
Yeah, it looks like she's
maybe
gone.
okay. That's
okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know some of you still have questions for Rebecca. Maybe you could, if you're comfortable, give your email or just say your email if people really want to find out, they could shoot you a note.
Yeah, my email's right here down at the bottom. It's my last name, McCabe @hawkmountain.org. Feel free. I will talk about Broadwings all day, so I would love to hear from you. Please don't be shy, and I'll definitely respond. So, yeah. That's
great. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was just phenomenal. I always learn so much. I hope you keep studying them forever because you're learning so much and there's still so much to learn.
There really is.
Yeah. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Josh, I'll turn things over to you for a minute unless you have anything else to add, Rebecca.
That's everything. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I appreciate it.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. And just to close, again, to echo some of Julie's comments, just a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time. And especially, for those that don't know, it takes quite a lot of work to put these presentations together. So all the prep work as well, it's much appreciated. So thanks everybody for joining. Again, visit HMANA.org/support to join our kettle, become a member with us, show some support financially if you're able to help us continue supporting great programs like this, as well as all the migration sites across North America and into Central America. So thanks everybody for joining. We look forward to next month as we welcome Ryan Phillips, who will talk to us on hook-billed kites, and look forward to the rest of our summer into fall as we have speakers lined up. So everybody have a great rest of your day, and we wish you all the best.